Hello, hello. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming today for Let There Be Lumbung. Just two housekeeping things. One is that the event will be live streamed, so in case you ask a question, your voice will be recorded and transmitted online. And the second thing is, if you need a receiver to be translated into German, please raise your hands that we can bring for you. The receivers are there for translation. And just want to say that tomorrow we're going to continue, and for more 3 days. Tomorrow is at 4 again with John Rosa, and at 5:30 we have Charles Esche. And welcome to Let There Be Lumbung. I hope you enjoy, and without further ado, I invite Mirwan Andan from Ruan Grupa to the stage. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, thanks so much for your participation and also for your visit to Documenta 15. It's about 5 or 6 days to go. I lost in time, so I forget how many days it comes to the end of Documenta 15. But again, thank you so much for your visit. And then today we are going to start to a talk series that we've been planning many months ago. The talk series titled Let There Be Lumbung, by presenting scholars, professors, academics, both from Indonesia and then from a couple of time zones in the world. And for today, we will be very happy to present one of our dear friend, Philippe Pirotte. Philippe, would you come with us? Philippe just arrived yesterday from Bali, from Central Indonesian time. Now he's not Central European time again, yeah? Central Indonesian time now, okay. Philippe Pirotte is going to present the talk titled Control Preventions. What is it, control prevention from his side? It will be briefly explained during this talk. And Philippe Pirotte is a professor on art history and curating, and also a curator. He's been curating many events here and there, and including in Jakarta Biennale in 2017. So if we have a term Indonesianist, we consider Philippe Pirotte is one of the Indonesianists who understand deeply, including how lumbung is operating and also how lumbung is functions from its origins. I'm not going to be very long to introduce, but also this is also an invitation for all of you all that this Let There Be Lumbung talk series will be organized up until 23 September. Speakers like Nikos Papastergiadis, John Rosa, Melanie Budianta, Hilmar Farid, Nuraini Julias Tuti, and Charles Esche will present their talks during this Let There Be Lumbung. So that's from me, and then Philippe, it's yours. Okay.
Is it working? Is it working? Yes, good. Okay. First and foremost, terima kasih banyak Ruang Rupa dan tim artistik dan komunitas Lumbung. I think it's very important, given the context in which Lumbung 1 has been evolving, to acknowledge the incredible work that has been done by the Lumbung community and by the artistic team in sometimes extremely difficult circumstances. We all have to remember that this all started with the pandemic and the lockdown, which probably also informed a lot the way of working, but I think it is an incredible feat to have been able to bring such a diverse, gigantic, polymorph project to Kassel under those circumstances. And I have the impression that had not been stressed enough in mainstream media being occupied with something else. It feels a bit lonely here, but I want to acknowledge a lot of people. What I'm going to try to say is a collage or an assemblage of thoughts, and I hope you think with me. And please feel free to interrupt whenever you want. I don't mind that at all. It's sometimes very helpful. Ask questions. This is also made not by myself alone. Like all texts are not made by an individual, they are made by more people, people that inspire you, people that exchange with you. Some people are here today in the room, they know who they are, and they probably will also recognize parts of their thinking in what is on this paper. So please also raise your hand, interrupt whenever you want. So it is a collage, it's an assemblage, there will be quotations, there will be thoughts. They are not definitive, they are things to try out, things to think with each other along. And I first start with a couple of quotations by James Scott. James Scott from his book Domination and the Arts of Resistance, written in 1999. So I start with the first quote, I think it's 4 in total. They are not necessarily following each other, but together they form an interesting way of thinking. So, quote, "It is in precisely this public domain where the effects of power relations are most manifest, and any analysis based exclusively on the public transcript is likely to conclude that subordinate groups endorse the terms of their subordination, and are willing, even enthusiastic partners in that subordination." End of quote. Other quote, "If subordinate discourse in the presence of the dominant is a public transcript, I shall use the term hidden transcript to characterize discourse that takes place off stage, beyond direct observation by power holders. The hidden transcript is thus derivative in the sense that it consists of those offstage speeches, gestures, and practices that confirm, contradict, or inflict what appears in the public transcript." End of quote. Third quote, what is certainly the case, however, is that the hidden transcript is produced for a different audience and under different constraints of power than the public transcript. By assessing the discrepancy between the hidden transcript and the public transcript, we may begin to judge the impact of domination on public discourse. End of quote. And the last quote, and that's the most important one, but you need the other ones to kind of put your collaging thinking in motion. Quote, "I believe that the notion of a hidden transcript helps us to understand those rare moments of political electricity when, often for the first time in memory, the hidden transcript is spoken directly and publicly in the teeth of power." And I guess that is something that happened here in the last 100 days. So that's kind of like a bit of context. Please take it with you in thinking about the rest that is coming now. I go back to the 50s and the 60s. Decolonial struggles in the 50s and 60s had to imagine nations. And that's, of course, coming from Benedict Anderson's famous book, or seminal book, Imagined Communities. They had to imagine nations as they needed to formulate understandable frameworks in their fight for self-determination. Understandable for who? That's the kind of double bind of this imagination of nations. They had to formulate understandable constructions like the nation state in order to be imaginable for empire. So it's a kind of a very interesting problem. In order to become independent and to force independence from empire, they had to formulate themselves as nation states. Hence the Bandung Conference, 1955, a gathering of Asian and African independent nations that kind of reinstated in an almost performative way their self-determination, but via the notion of the nation state. We come to now. The Lumbung proposal left that era of playing fool to catch wise. They left it behind. Because that's the kind of like the double bind. In order to be understood, you have to talk in the language of those that hold power. And I guess an important element in this leaving the playing fool behind is the introduction of words from another language. I think it was very, very crucial that certain terms or certain practices here were not in English. Nongkrong, majelis, meidan, etc. It is a way to not kind of like be forced in this double bind of empire. It is a move away from understandability. And I guess that's very important if we talk about the word understanding. Because in order to be understood, there should have been negotiation with the institutional artistic frameworks in power, be them financially, organizationally, in terms of logistics, resources, etc. But as we know, negotiation is counterproductive when dealing with empire. The revolutionary, according to Frantz Fanon, inserts himself among the people without noise. Read, outside of the noise of mainstream media. This formulation is very important, it's pivotal even, but because it's so casually understated, I repeat, the revolutionary inserts himself amongst the people. It's kind of like an understatement. Its myriad implications risk to escape realization. Because the casual author and reader of the mainstream media would not read that, would not see that. Amilcar Cabral adds that in the revolutionary process, the desire for visibility is a problem. It's a teething disease. And the insurrectionary yearnings before the oppressor or before empire make no sense, because it's a begging for understanding. Of course, there is a huge problem with the notion understanding. It literally means to stand under, to subject oneself to. Somehow something difficult when one deals with a radical rethinking of what Oliver Marchar calls the documenta hegemony machines. Multi-perspectival learning in an ongoing process was proposed as a way out of this problematic of subordination in relation to a sharing of knowledge. But when Rangrupa and the artistic team and the Lumbung community show the preparedness to learn, I am wondering what it means, what it shows, or what it exposes when this preparedness, when this attitude was answered with an authoritarian eagerness to teach. Doesn't that awake the goals of a bygone era? I leave that up to you. A lot of the supposed scandal around Lumbung 1 had to do with Rangrupa and the artistic team's alleged refusal to understand the German context, as if the German context was reduced to one single narrative, the one that has been reiterated again and again in the press. Aren't, let's say, diasporas from a manifold of places and history, aren't they also forming many German contexts? Aren't the many, many audiences around in the almost 100 days also hailing from German contexts? I also don't want to eat the fabricated story of confrontation between the so-called Global South and Germany. As such would automatically imply this double bind of who subordinates to whom. More, I'm convinced there is an old-fashioned class struggle at work. In German language, there is even a way of apologizing that implies or constructs this class difference. It betrays an absolute unease with apologizing. Ich bitte Verständnis. Literally, it says, I ask for understanding. I ask for understanding. So while apologizing, it is still a way to ask to subordinate. This is kind of like, I guess, one of the very typical examples in a manifold of European languages where empire transpires in the semantics and in the way the language is constructed. So, then we come to discursivity, which has also been a problem. The criticism that lumbung 1 lacks discursive complexity, as a very famous artist kind of like brought about in the press. Nongkrong is an oral culture. We need to talk. Nongkrong has families in the world called Wakale in Senegal or Ulonga in Angola. It's a strategic way to stay out of the struggle of holding power over interpretative and discursive frameworks. Those frameworks that become self-congratulatory realms that often censor, because it's something that starts from a false discursive activity and has repercussions on logistics. Here we note a very significant difference with Okoye-Wezer's Documenta 11, which was built on the idea of a certain global south radically entering the castle of empire via discursive legitimation. Lumbung 1 never acknowledged that castle. If discourse is a way to make things understandable, to be incorporated or subordinated into a framework, then it cannot be directly questioned or contested as oral speech can be, because it's in an immediate kind of like uttering with its author. It's still kind of close to its author. Because the discursive speech has been detached from its author. That's a bit the same. So what comes to mind here is a criticism of what Stefano Harney called the sovereignty of the concept, a concept that is detached from its author, a concept, a way of thinking, a discursive way of thinking that becomes currency, something that you can trade with. That's what is refused in nongkrong, that is what is refused in Wakale, that is what is refused in Ulonga. Stefano Harney writes about this concept which is abstracted, abducted, weaponized in a strategy, and stolen into ownership. But the refusal of that kind of sovereign authorship, and here we come into the other criticism about curatorial responsibility, which is kind of like attached to authorship. Curatorial responsibility in the terms used time and again to criticize Lumbung 1, but there is no refusal of responsibility per se. There is a refusal of the myth of responsibility of the self-improving individual. The self-improving individual is the modern notion of the artist, the individual artist, and later the curator. They came to being in the 18th century in Europe, alongside economic improvement of property, including human property, and they were the authors of sovereign concepts. And here I'm going to go to a rather long quotation of Stefano Harney. So as described by Harney, such individual is characterized, quote, by the quest to prove one can improve oneself and by so doing be qualified to supervise the improvement of property and of others. The rise of this self-improving subject who needs only himself to improve, to be self-altering, self-sufficient, is a truly genocidal and geocidal figure. This figure has been threatening since the birth of European colonialism. But this figure really takes hold with the combination of improvement in commercial and plantation agriculture and the improvement ideologies of the Enlightenment. And then this figure becomes the factory owner. This figure claims to self-sufficiency, to being self-made. And these claims are as ludicrous and as dangerous as the idea that the colonial fort was sovereign and self-sufficient. Of course, it relied on the land and people it was built to attack continuously for their resources. So too, with this self-made, self-improving bourgeois subject, he too requires massive resources to pronounce himself as self-sufficient. Resources this figure can never acknowledge. Beyond all the social reproductive labor of women, children, the elders, and servants, he requires these supply chains and the labor on them, and the assembly line and all the labor on that. And behind this, the massive exploitation of the earth upon which that system is based. That's the self-sufficient bourgeois subject. And I'm afraid, I throw that in between, but it becomes important for the next part, I'm afraid the so-called self-sufficient bourgeois subject has no friends. Of course, the proliferation of these modern subjects chase those who reject the idea of that type of individuation all around the globe. Thus, the situation becomes more volatile than ever. Continuous improvement only barely holds the line against continuous revolution. End of quote. So the not yet incorporated, who reject the idea of such individuation as a false promise of freedom, make the corporation go ballistic, even hysterically afraid. And so the not yet incorporated are framed as primitive or uncivilized by the actual corporation-run empire. Therefore, what happened over the last months, Rangrupa, the artistic team, and the Lumbung community had to be abducted for some powers and opinion makers in the German cultural sphere, stubbornly holding to an old colonial plantation logic. The invited curators are there to be exploited, and knowledge will be extracted from their project. The curators and artistic community have to be confined to be mere content providers, and it's not only happening in this case, it's happening kind of like more and more structurally that cultural protagonists are there to be content providers in a pre-given structure. Nobody touches the framework. So what they really bring about, now migrated in Lumbung 1, protecting its own context on their terms, from either being crushed or optimized or used as extractable source material, as the institution needs what they bear but cannot bear what they bring, in a sentence of Fred Moulton. Only supposed to self-denunciate in public, this comes down to working in a context of democratic despotism and in a context of abduction. I used the word before. Abduction is a combination of being taken and sent away at the same time. Hence, not anymore Documenta 15, but Lumbung 1. Hence, make friends, not art. Make friends, not art is a Lumbung slogan that has been mocked as a refusal to think the question of art today. But maybe not art could mean don't make the kind of object based on the extraction of resources that end up in vitrines lamenting the loss of resources. Maybe it means don't make those strategized sovereign concepts in the suspension of time and space, in the suspension of materiality and relationships. Maybe it means don't make those things that seemingly have a sovereign existence in a vacuum. Make friends can also mean considering or indeed making artworks as friends, as part of social relations, as part of a society of friends. So it's not about being enfranchised as an art object, becoming an artwork exclusively from the standpoint of being discussed in the parameters of art theory, art market, and art world. No, on the contrary, it's about giving art a life in a society and a related web of social obligations. Here I think of attributing intentions to statues. Think about Sebastián Díaz Morales' film. It's an appeal conscious of the fact that we need each other to live. Friends and art as friends in mutual support. As Alfred Gell, he's an anthropologist of art, he's passed away a couple of years ago, propounds, artistic manifestations are the social relations in the vicinity of persons, objects, and activities which mediate social agency. Artistic manifestations are the equivalent of persons, or more precisely, social agents, or in human language, friends. This involves the radical affirmation of the personhood of artistic manifestations, and at the same time, a radical defamiliarization or a relativation of the notion of persons. I mean, the notion of those individual authors. In spite of centuries of colonization and enclosures, the ideal of individual freedom still can't get hold on many parts of the world. Even in Europe, where so many tools of colonization were refined, the roots of freedom were different. And here I go to a very interesting text written by Nick Montgomery and Carla Bergman, and it's called Joyful Militancy, Building Thriving Resistance in Toxic Times. Centuries ago, some Europeans had a more relational conception of freedom. which wasn't just about the absence of external constraints, but also about our immersion in the relationships that sustain us and make us thrive. Freedom and friend share the same early Indo-European root, fri or pri, meaning love. This root made its way into different languages like Norse, Celtic, Hindi, Russian, and German. To be free was not to be unrestricted. To be free was to be a friend among loved ones, which conveys the idea of a shared power that grows. Lumbung will continue because it proposes a radicality grounded in affect. Make friends, not art, proposes becoming different and more capable together, rather than a banal affair of private preferences in relation to the norm and under technological surveillance. Make friends, not arts, and Lumbung run against dominant strands of both Western knowledge and morality, which strive for universalism and generalizability. This is where Lumbung clashes with the foundational ideas of sovereignty, the citizen subject, the nation state, and the economy, all products of just a particular history producing our modern world. Let there be Lumbung. Thank you.
Yeah, as Philippe said, that anyone can just jump in while he talk, but no one jump in. So, anyone want to jump in now? So please, any comments, questions, or anything that want to say something? Please, one mic. Okay, the mic is there. Please come forward. You want to have a seat? You want to have a seat?
Yeah, maybe you have to answer.
Hello. Thank you so much for your super powerful words. There's one aspect that you touched and that made me think a lot during your talk, and it's the aspect of responsibility, and that we kind of have to rethink responsibility to maybe break it free from the construct of responsibility as it is being taught inside the empire. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, maybe you can expand on how we have to rethink responsibility a little bit more. It made me think of Donna Haraway, actually, who says responsibility means to be response-able. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And maybe we can find a new way of rethinking that notion.
Yes, I think I will not be able to directly answer your question, but maybe via a detour. Responsibility was invoked in the debates around the documenta in context of dialogue not happening or not functioning or so-called refused dialogue. And I think that responsibility is for sure a shared notion. It comes from a multi-perspectival context. And I think the proposition that Lumbung 1 did was a proposition when I talk about nongkrong and similar practices, is that a dialogue is installed through the act of speaking, not through a framework in which you are allowed or obliged or forced to speak. And I think that is a very, very important thing that we can also transfer to the notion of responsibility. This responsibility is not something to be ascribed to a sovereign author, which apparently in our, let's say, European history we did way too long. And it is a kind of way that responsibility is performed, but not really lived and acted. And I think that's, it's not that it necessarily has worked, that's not what I want to say here, but it's a kind of it's not been tried in that sense. It's not been tried to accept invitations to let talk. It's been changed into a context that has been forced upon, in which people were allowed to admit or to go on their knees. And I think that's what has not happened, and I think that's a really sad situation, and I think there should be, maybe in our European context, some soul searching to see how we do that in the future. If that's an answer to your question. Ah, sorry. It's a bit exposed.
So, any question or any comments?
We have one here.
Okay.
One more question, yeah. Yes, again, thank you very much for the presentation. I really like the examples you gave about how language also influences thinking or experiencing certain things. And the example you gave was Bitte Verständnis und understanding, standing under. And you were talking it in relation to empire, so that sort of felt quite intra-cultural. And I was curious, in your meeting with German culture or empire, European culture, how do you feel or think that the use of this language among people within those cultures affects their relations or their, yeah?
Well, I'm European. I'm a Belgian, so I have an imperial history. Yeah. Okay. So that's
yeah.
It's very hard to kind of like adopt a position. It's more like I try to formulate something that questions our languages. And for example, something, maybe there's also a detour, but it's very interesting. Indonesia is one of the very few countries in the world that upon independence didn't adopt the language of the former colonizer. Yeah? Mm-hmm. Already in the 1920s, there has been a development of Bahasa Indonesia, which is a Indonesian Esperanto, because on the many different islands, there is so many different languages. But I think that it's a very different collective psychological situation. Imagine they all would have spoken Dutch amongst each other. Yeah, it's a kind of a very different thing than, in Congo, former Belgian colony. Now they speak French amongst each other, which is, and in Senegal too, which kind of like is an immediate, maybe a. I don't know, I cannot speak for that, but I have the impression that it's a kind of like a permanent reinstallment of the trauma, yeah? Consciously, unconsciously. The trauma is reiterated and reiterated through the language, certainly when those languages contain semantics that are testifying of the oppression, yeah? So there is this kind of like that's very interesting, and I think that was what, for Lumbung 1, it was incredibly interesting that there was this choice to use all these terms that are not English or French, but to use a different, and to bring that on top, to kind of like occupy a certain linguistic discursive habit with other language. Yeah. I think it's very, very, very important. Jean Genet writes a lot about that. A part of the trauma also of, he writes about it in context of the Black Panthers, is that how much the language, English in that case, is misused or deconstructed, etc., still they enrich the language of empire. And it's something to be thought of, but there are different opinions about it. There's people that claim that there is other types of English that are really like outside of that enrichment of empire. But I think it's something to be considered at least. And I think it's a very, very important element of this project that a language was kind of like introduced that was not the negotiated language that is normally used in this kind of art world projects.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anybody? Yeah.
Thanks so much for your presentation. I would like you to ask a little bit, expand, because you make that kind of phrase, make friends, not art. And why friends? Because you mentioned somehow in connection with love, which is very quite challenging relationship. But don't you think it's a little bit depoliticizing? Because can you imagine you use comrade or kinship, which has much more explicit political implications than friendship? Just curious, thank you.
Yeah, I totally understand what you, but it depends on your notion of friendship. Yeah? If the friendship is like without risks, if it's a kind of like a utilitarian friendship, a typical neoliberal friendship, that's not the friendship what I'm talking about. It's a friendship that, that at the same time hurts, that is going beyond the kind of like immediate acquaintancy, like it's a responsibility. Yeah, you're part of a shared responsibility under whatever circumstances, and I think it's also another responsibility. If you start to think about artworks as friends, then there's another responsibility. It's not the responsibility to kind of like throw them in a currency. Yeah, and also friendship is not something you throw in a currency. So in that sense, I don't think it's debilitating. I think it's very difficult and very responsible and very hard to do. And in that sense, very complex.
I also have a question about over here.
Ah, yeah.
Yeah, about same thing, make art, not friends. And I think you said it was about, correct me, but creating networks of social obligation? Something like that, right?
Without networks.
No, sorry, what was the word? Because I'd really like to be able to quote that. Can you repeat it?
No, it's more creating relationships. Think that it's kind of like it's kind of like organize a relational web, not a network. Networks are like irresponsible. Yeah, it's creating a relational web with responsibilities, and it's the idea to kind of consider, which is an old idea also. You know, but it's maybe renewed or maybe in a different version, to consider artworks as subjects, as co-subjects in this kind of like relational context. And in that sense, I think it's a beginning to unpack or to kind of start with that sentence, make friends, not art, instead of like, and that's debilitating, say like, oh, that is a kind of like a sentence that refuses to think the concept. No, but that's happened in the press.
Yeah,
you know,
totally.
it has been ridiculed.
Yeah.
And I think, no, it's a very interesting sentence that initially proposes a possible paradox, because we project on it that from a position of thinking that it is considered a paradox. But what when you start not consider it a paradox? What when you start to consider it as something that is alive, that is an action, a relational action? Make friends, not art. What is you can interpret it in, is not necessarily make friends and don't make art. Make friends and make not art.
Yeah, no,
and not art becomes another concept.
All right, but that was just my intro to my thought.
Oh, sorry.
No worries, no worries. So because I was just in the Hallenbad, the Alte Hallenbad, and there you see very clear, you know, making friends and art that is actually very political. So I think ideally, right, we would have politics that reflect our culture, politics that are born of our culture. What we have, however, is culture that is born of our politics, culture that reflects very problematic politics. And at the same time, we have a big Demo-Kultur in Deutschland. Die Leute lieben Demos. And, and so it's like, I guess it's a matter of urgency, right? Urgency feeds any struggle. And so the lack of urgency maybe makes for these schlapp kind of intentions, but what can that mean in a country full of people that are willing to go out and demonstrate? What does it mean? How? And this is maybe not to you, but to all the Germans here in the room. What does that sentence, "Make art, not friends," mean translated into a country or a space where we don't feel the urgency, but actually need to share the responsibility, I guess, of that urgency with others?
Maybe a detour also, I don't know. Maybe I can answer through a detour. It's like, in a very classical notion of politics, all our acts are political acts. Yeah? On the other hand, we live in a time that is very hard, that everything we do is immediately politicized from the outside. And I think that's extremely tiring. And I think the sentence, make friends, not art, is kind of like, at the same time, a very political sentence, but a sentence that also refuses the politicization, and which is kind of imposed from outside. And I sense in what you say that there is a fatigue also. And I think that maybe a way through that fatigue is kind of like, yeah, opt for this relationability of friends. I think Lumbung 1 was not from their organization out or from their way of working out antagonistic. It has been politicized from the outside. It has been forced in antagonism, but it was not antagonistic. And I think that's something that we are so used to work in these antagonisms, yeah? Or to being forced in formulate our thoughts and our feelings and our desires in these antagonisms. And I think that was another very, I don't know if it's a subtext or a real text in Lumbung 1, but that it was not formulated as an antagonism. And that's also, I think, something very, how to say it, like welcome in an art world that has been feeding on antagonisms. Yeah? And I think maybe the same for a broader part of society. And in that sense, yeah, there is also the French are on the streets, you know, it's also a culture that is liking demos, etc. But it's kind of like, at the same time, I'm wondering where the demos are in the energy crisis and in etc. I think the demos have been, how do you say it, like, there's opioids that keep people to Facebook and don't go on demos anymore, you know? That's a sad evolution too. But that's another story.
I also have a question. So we talked about responsibility and soul searching. And my question is how soul searching can happen, especially when you're working in, let's say, white institutions, as a white person, but also as a person of color. Maybe you can't answer that, I guess, but other people. Because making friends in white institutions as a person of color is not the easiest thing.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for your question. I was reading some material before here, and some coherence maybe contribute to your question. So alongside the concept of individuation, there's also concept of trans-individuation. And I think these two concepts go hand to hand. So trans-individuation is integration of personal growth, and that need to happen within the framework of trans-individuation, which means together with others. So this slogan of make friends, not art, actually is kind of translation of this, academic terms that I think as a non-Western grew up, like work here, I think if you would be open to exchange and stay honesty and stay fair, even things happen not unfair to you, that will slowly turns out to be positive to, small steps. So I'm personally very hopeful and optimistic about it. So thank you.
I guess it starts to becoming responsive amongst us, which is very good because.
Can I ask one question? Yes, sorry. I would like to get back to your question because I think it's really important, and I thank you so for being optimistic, but still we are living in a world that still is very contradictory. And Philippe, I would like to ask you, or also the people of One Gruppe, how do you see that what I wanted to ask is about the conditions that we have to shape all together to get the lumbung to be more sustainable in the future, in the sense of, okay, what is it that we need to change in the existing systemic change in the art world. I want to don't make it too large, but like 4 or 5 points where we now can say, okay, if we try to elaborate those basic points, and I'm thinking about architecture, I'm thinking about the institutional structures, I'm thinking about everything that keeps power in place. And I was just wondering what we need to do, like what are the conditions to make lumbung in a future format for the arts?
Step out of the power position, leave it. It's not 5 points, it's 1 point. Step out of the power position and leave it.
Sorry, I also have a question.
Okay, so that's very good. But then I would say, okay, what do we do with the institution? You're a director of still, I think, or not anymore.
I stepped out.
Okay, that's wrong, but very good. So stepping out, and then what happens? For me, my future
Step
thinking
out
is
and
like,
join.
huh?
Step out and join.
Okay, good.
So I think also this comment and question is also, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's also aimed to us in Ruang Rupa, or yeah. So
please,
anyone of us from Ruang Rupa want to respond this?
I have a question.
Yeah, but also I will start also that how to do it is that we did documenta. When documenta came to us, we didn't see it as an opportunity because we are not opportunists. So.
Hi, thank you for the nice conversation. To step out, that's one thing. I think it will make a lot of things different. I think I would propose to evaluate as well, other than or next to the colonial. So it's not only step out, but also devaluate or like reevaluate, because like many of the institution or practices also really based on the values of a neoliberal system. So I think it should be also devaluate. I think the colonial is not enough. I think it should be also devaluate, other than to close down one museum. I think it should be also devaluate all the stolen objects that are inside. So just like I'm surprised that my friends, not artists, become so overthought. But it's really I think it's more like just add. I mean, like, because we wrote that like maybe like 10 years ago in like in a small book. But for us, it's more like a verb or like adjective rather than sort of like, because friendship as well. For us, it has historical trauma towards that. We don't really use. I mean, like after '98, we have a big important law actually about collusion, nepotism, and corruption, which is really based on friendship and families as well. And we have that really problematic relationship with such a form actually. So we know that this, when we put that as a Mac Friends, is actually really also about responsibilities, about making a safe space and so on, and really deal with that and really work on that rather than sort of like a collusion or a nepotism, such a thing. So just to add, step out and join. I think I will propose, if you cannot beat them, join us.
Join us, and because lumbung will be continue. You want to say something? So, any question or comments again? Yeah, please.
Yes, first of all, I just want to applaud you for a very beautiful and inspiring lumbung #1 or documenta #15. Don't you think that the controversy maybe just come from the simple fact that we are now listening to the people who have direct experience of oppression and misery, and that before that it was very often, I think of Johan Grimon Perez' Dial History, or Joseph Beuys, or Harun Farocki, applauded political artworks, but not from a direct perspective. It was like about the oppression. So maybe you just open the beautiful can of worms of the justified anger from people who have actually really experienced oppression. I'm thinking about the beautiful films from the Sada Collective from Baghdad, talking about the bombings and how it is to experience that. Isn't it that simple? The controversies that you have gotten yourself into is that the anger and the justified anger of the oppressed are now finally being heard, and that is maybe for first at the documenta. I might be wrong. There might be some there, but yeah.
Maybe we'll answer it together a bit. There is another thing that I think is important, that is a big difference with when you talk about works of Johan Grimont and other works that have been shown at earlier editions of Documenta. I don't think Johan Grimont was there 100 days.
No, that's what I mean.
And I think that's a very important thing, that this Lumbung 1 tried, notwithstanding visa complications, to not have works taken from somewhere, but kind of like works shown with the communities of people that were making them, in the sense that the communities of people were also like talking about them, and we're here, we're working on the spot, we're kind of going into dialogues with local communities, etc., etc. So there is another idea of context, not without problems, probably, but there is a whole different way of presence. There is maybe within the metaphor, these artworks are friends, so they need their friends. You know, they need friends to accompany them. They need, and I think that's a huge difference. But that's not necessarily an answer to your question. So maybe the other.
No, but maybe
Can
just
I ask a question too?
Just one final clarification. What I meant was what Harun Farocki is making films about bombing, and now we are seeing films about people that are actually being bombed. And there's a big difference of making a film about pilots that bomb and actually being bombed and making films from that perspective. So there's a directness there.
No, I just wanted to reply to a comment that I don't know exactly who said it before, of like this question of being friends on art and what does that mean for the Germans in the room. I think this is big part of the controversy of this documenta, that is not, like, I think half of the people in this room, we are not Germans, and we have all been hosted by this exhibition, and I think this just proves the importance of this concept of being make friends and not art, and the idea of like hosting all of us as a community, and that, yeah, we are hosted by Germany. Yes, we have, our artists have been involved with like local communities, but like all of us that we are not from Germany, we are like, I just find that comment really exclusionary, like to mention specifically Germans in the room, when this exhibition, I think most of the artists here are not even from Europe, and a lot of the artists that we have been hosted are also not from Europe. So that to me just kind of proves the point of the idea of making friends and not art. And that's what I wanted to share. Thanks.
So yeah, I think we're 3 minutes to go before the. We want to adjust. I mean, we don't want to limit ourselves to this already scheduled, but if we still have questions and comments, please, yeah.
Thank you so much. I would like to ask, actually, if you can elaborate on the join. I think some of us are actually really thinking about strategies of the left. There is also, I mean, I can only speak personally about my discontent, about, I feel actually the left is so dispersed in a way that it's so easy for this, major forces on the right to just take control. And I'm just really wondering if you can articulate a bit more about what it is that you invite to join to, and how do you see, or how do you kind of envision the alternative? It can also be like the most, in most strategic terms, or whatever it is that really describes your vision, because there is this practical level that I feel sometimes we really need to actually understand better. And it's out of real curiosity, because there's
I guess you mentioned
this
two
desire
things.
also.
Yeah, I guess you mentioned two things. Like, one of the very deplorable things you mentioned is the fact that the left, or what is the left? The so-called left is fighting itself. It comes also immediately from the fact that the left is traditionally critical, and so there is this trap that we start to kind of like being critical about each other all the time, which allows for other forces. So if we can talk about what is the left, and that allows other forces to kind of like misuse that, for sure. At the same time, I don't know necessarily if, when we're talking about, when you mentioned that I talked about joining, how strategic that is. I think joining is also probably more humble than strategic, and it's a risk, and it's kind of like you can't bet on a return, you can't bet on a projected outcome. So in that sense, it is very difficult to me personally. Maybe other people can have but to me personally, it's very difficult to say like that's where we want to end necessarily. I think maybe it is something similar if you want to theorize it to theories of communalism, like how you join with maybe you share a value, and that value makes you federate further. That doesn't mean you share all the values, but the value that you share is the way to join each other, and maybe there is more, but you don't know. It's kind of like, don't try to solve it via the superstructure. Right. But it's a bet or a risk, or I don't know. The joining is a risk. And another risk but it's kind of like a risk in relation to the kind of like projected outcome. There is no projected outcome. Right. Yeah, it's a practice in the moment. I don't know. It's maybe too far already what I say. It's like, I don't know, but it's also good.
Thank you.
I'm always the one opening questions in the end of the discussion that need 2 more hours, but it's also a position of great privilege to say, step out of it. Step out of what? And I think the struggle you were talking about is one that comes from people that are not privileged to step out of anything, but need new structures or need the belief and the hope that there are new structures for them to hook on to. And I think we should be very, very, very aware of the fact that we are goddamn privileged, all of us here, but that we can use that privilege and that we can, but that we need to be aware of it. Sorry, I had to say that.
Yeah, I have a further question on the stepping out issue, because we're all sitting still in the documenta all together. So it's the context we're in. And my question was, you talked about documenta as this hegemonic machine. So I would like you to answer this question, like how do you see this then, that we should step out of, leave the hegemonic machines, but at the same time we're still in it. So how does that relate together? And also I wonder, because I can see somehow that staying in this institution, in this machine, and doing things differently, but maybe there are some failures, because I also read in the introduction of the catalog that, okay, we did this, it could have been done differently and so on. So sometimes there is regret and mistakes, I guess. But at the same time, and maybe this will only become visible years afterwards, like has there been a paradigm shift doing this within the documenta, or will it be subsumed and appropriated later on, which is also a risk? So maybe you can elaborate on this difficult question.
There's many questions, but yes, there is from the conversations with also people here, there is, of course, consideration about recuperation. There is, of course, I think there is no fear of making mistakes. I think that's a part of this whole process of, whether you call it stepping out, that was a personal thing, but it's like, and indeed a privileged thing. But yeah, as you said, if this is a paradigm shift, then we will see it not now, immediately, but I also think there is the fact that lumbung will continue outside of the framework of documenta is maybe also an answer to your question, you know. It's kind of like there is something that was already there, that kind of had a moment of a celebration of certain results. That was then, in fact, what is being shown here, and it continues. So it is kind of like it's another use of the institution, that's for sure. It's a very, very different use of the institution, and maybe that's the maximum of answer that I can at the moment give to that, but it's kind of like, and that was like laid out from the beginning. And it was also proposed, it could have been refused by the institution. So it could have been, oh no, we don't want it. It was kind of like half-heartedly accepted, so to say. But I think that's maybe the answer. It's not something we don't know, or nobody, maybe people know what I don't know at least. So, but it's another, it's another way of thinking resources. It's another way of thinking artistic labor or artistic work, if you say it that way. And, you know, like I don't think it's also like, if it's a worry of, let's say, the lumbung community, what the art world thinks about it. For example, that are also these kind of things like, we are very often having these reflexes, but what does the institution think about it? We don't care. What does the art world think about it? Maybe we don't care, maybe. That's a possibility, you know, that it's relating to other relations than the ones we are used to, yeah? And maybe it can also bring about the ones that we are used to, but then that's the ones we are asking to join, yeah? I don't know if that's
It's a different story, I think, like getting in and changing the use of the institution, maybe completely failing, ending up in a kind of war, but then it's about taking this risk, then a clear-cut stepping out of all this.
It's not that it's a strategy that, like when I was talking about stepping out, it was a specific strategy at a specific moment with a specific context, and that was probably the best for trying something. Yeah, I'm not sure if that should be generalized necessarily. Yeah? It is a possibility, and I think this is also how I saw Lumbung 1 is a gigantic parliament with often very contradictory possibilities. And I think that's the interesting thing of the communal way of working. Even amongst all these contradictory possibilities, there are sometimes values, maybe one value that is shared between the different positions in that gigantic parliament. And that's what has been worked with, or that is where you start somehow. And that doesn't mean you agree on all the other values. It's kind of like it's maybe a limited set, but it's kind of like another bet, or another practice. You accept the differences, but you work from the one or two or maybe more values that you share, which is it's a total different thing than trying to find a universalism or trying to find a superstructure that we all have to subject ourselves to, which is then invented by a bunch of whoever, And I think that's maybe the big difference, and it's not new. It's been tried out in other ways, political ways. It's been tried out in many other ways, but it's kind of It's always been difficult to build that up, that's for sure. Because that's what I think the attacks, that was the reason, that there was something built up that a specific German, European, blah, blah, blah society could not bear. And that's why and then everything is used, to discredit it, basically. But you see, it's not discredited because there is so many people that are, that want to join, yeah? So...
I actually just didn't really have a question. I wanted to say thank you to Lumbung 1, because this is groundbreaking for the cultural landscape. And we are not operating... Yes, give them their applause. Give them their applause. It is actually the privileged people in the room that think we should be discursive about the courage, the vulnerability, the risk, the endurance, the generosity that it takes to do this work in the art world. And we are not even looking at this with that, the power, the vision that's here. And so many people are saying, what are the alternatives? What are the strategies? Look at the artwork. The global south, the global majority have mapped it out. If we're paying attention to the artwork, if we're paying attention to what has been curated, the answers, the solutions are there. And so while we're sitting here talking about the kind of contentions around it, instead of celebrating the complexity, the power, the beauty, the vision that's been held in all of this with so much generosity, and as people from the global majority, we feel seen. We feel seen. This has never happened before. So thank you. We need to be saying thank you for making this groundbreaking cultural political intervention that is a roadmap for so many of us. Thank you.
+1 to everything that +1,000 to everything that my friend Farzana just said. This has been incredible as someone of the global majority to experience. And it is infuriating that
so much of the conversation here has been taken up around questions around what it means to step out and what it means to step away. As someone that does a lot of translation between the global majority and institutions of power, of cultural power, of political power, I think, so often folks think that we can just, folks of privilege feel like they can just stay in these institutions and, and then ask people to perform their trauma for institutional attention. Ask people to explain themselves to you so that you understand. And so, like, a lot of us, we're not resourced to support you in your personal development until you're willing to cede power. And so I know there's a lot, and I don't blame it. Like, so many of us are socialized and conditioned. We got our degrees and our PhDs, and we worked hard. And like, everyone worked hard, absolutely. But it's not about working hard. It's about the way that the structures have been set up and who is doing the labor, the unpaid labor, the emotional work, taking the risks that were taken here, the conversation that we had earlier. Who has to sort of bear that weight? And so I think that it's been really just, A, we need to celebrate and say thank you. And I think B, just how much of this conversation has been around just like the nuances of like stepping out has been really difficult. The comfort of whiteness, yeah. So anyway, yeah.
Yes. Thank you. I just want to thank you for this incredible space of enlightenment and inspiration and encouragement. This is my first day here, and I think it's as if the lumbung and the organizers, everyone is saying to me, do not stay passive, become active, and providing a space that steps out of the institutes, out of it sounds weird, the safe space of the institutes, which is not a safe space, but to have the courage to step out of the dogmas and the pillars in art is super inspiring, because when I look around in the world, there is this collection of problems. If you look at nature, if you look at animals, if you look at the money, the way money system, banking system, well, you can go on and on and on. So many problems right now that needs to be solved, and that need people and hearts and minds to do this work. And I want to thank Documenta and Lumbung for providing a space of light and inspiration and courage to make a step in changing this mindset. And I have the feeling that you tell me to not be passive, because passiveness is enslavement, but to become active and to listen to your intuition.
Thank you. So, thank you so much for all comments, but we have one more before we close. Yeah.
Thank you very much, especially to Philippe. This step out things reminds me of, maybe it's Soren Kierkegaard who said about leap of faith. But this time, our faith is not in supernatural being, our faith is in human being. We put ourselves, our risk, our future, not to something that beyond our reach, beyond our understanding, but to our friends. That's why make friends first. After that, we can make soulful art. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Niron Arsuka, for your comment. But also thank you so much again for all your time, because it's to share things. Time is one of the most precious things to share, including your time to be here, your availability to sit here and then listening and participating this today. Let there be lumbung kick-start talk series. Please join us again. This is also a call to join Let There Be Lumbung talks that will be continued tomorrow by inviting our friends John Rosa, a professor on history from British Columbia University, Vancouver, and also Charles Esche, director of Vanabo Museum. John Rosa will talk about the dangerous images and also the moral panic in Indonesia since 1965 up until today, including how to make art collective-based, also their struggle up until now to the present, including maybe touch upon some ruang rupas context. Charles Esche talks will explain about the first exhibition on 21st century. The talk will be started at 4 p.m. And Philippe, do you have a last remark before we go to hang out?
Let's hang out and eat and.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So yeah, we need to hang out. Yeah. So thank you so much, and then see you tomorrow. Thank you so much for all the. Thanks so much for all of our friends who's been preparing this. Philippe Steinberg and team, and also Undine Schäfer, the international sign translator, and also Alexander Fahrenholz for your support also, and all of our friends here who's been supporting us, not up until 23rd, but also until September 25th. Viva!